everyone, CrossFlux here, delivering on a promise. As some of you may know, I finally finished my Let's Play of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Red Rescue Team, something that took me much longer than it should have. Now that I've finally experienced the game in its entirety once again, I feel I have a better outlook on the game as a whole. As a result, I want to do a full-on review of the game. No matter what, it's impossible to review a game completely objectively, because we all have different experiences with games. I'm no exception. Red Rescue Team is a very nostalgic game for me, and one that I've played many times throughout the course of my life. Despite my attachment to this game, I will do my absolute best to review it as fairly as I can. There will also be spoilers for the game, so please proceed with caution. Now, without further ado, the Mystery Dungeon series is a niche subsection of spin-off Pokemon games. The first of this series is Red and Blue Rescue Team, named perhaps as an homage to the original Red and Blue games for the main series. These are roguelike dungeon crawlers where the player must manage their resources. Like many other RPGs, the story starts out pretty mundane, but quickly escalates into a save the world sort of thing. When I talk about games, I like to start with the narrative, since that's usually the part that sticks with me the most. As I mentioned before, Red Rescue Team starts off pretty mundanely. The player takes a personality test of sorts, and then wakes up to discover that, oh no, they've been transformed into a Pokemon. As in traditional JRPG fashion, you have no other memories. So, how do you know that you're really a human? Let's not think about it. You quickly meet your partner, and are thrust into a situation where you must save a Caterpie. Afterwards, you form a rescue team. Basically, a task force, whose job it is to save Pokemon in peril. Apparently, natural disasters have become more and more common, and strange places called mystery dungeons have cropped up. Many Pokemon across the world are growing feral. You and your partner decide to do what you can to help others by forming this rescue team. It doesn't take long before you learn that you are connected to the increase in natural disasters somehow. This leads the other townsfolk to not trust you, and they end up believing that if they sacrifice you, then the world will be fixed. Well, that escalated quickly. The only person on your side through this revelation is your partner. Together, the two of you escape into the wild as fugitives to not only save your skins, but also to learn about what's really causing the disasters. Eventually, it's revealed that you are connected to the natural disasters, but not because you're the cause. Instead, you are summoned to the world of Pokemon to save it. Throughout the story, you've been receiving messages from a mysterious Gardevoir through your dreams. Over time, they become more and more clear. Once you learn about your destiny, you determine to scale the Sky Tower and ask Rayquaza to blow up an incoming meteor, which has upset the world's balance. Now, what I like about this story is that it does a good job of balancing the mundane, everyday life of a rescue team and the important events that drive the plot forward. I don't like how the dreams with Gardevoir are handled, though. It's a really cheap way of tickling one's interest without actually giving any narrative substance. The last dream you get with Gardevoir even goes as far as to say, now is the right time to reveal everything. Like, really, Gardevoir? Now is the time? You know, like the day before I have to go into the sky to save the world? You think now is the right time to confirm everything we've already learned? Why not earlier, so I could have better prepared for this day? But I digress. Although I do like the story as a whole, the post-game story events are definitely pretty lazy. There are very few cutscenes during this part of the game, and it's pretty much just a montage of events with miscellaneous legendary Pokemon. Is the player character just Ash who is transformed into a Pokemon? Because the player character ends up meeting every legendary Pokemon that had been revealed in the series at the time. I find that to be a little silly. Another thing I don't like about the story is, how are the player character and their partner so strong? They're able to hold their own against a slew of legendary Pokemon, a well-established and world-famous rescue team, and survive on their own for weeks on end. Why could they accomplish such feats as quelling Groudon and convincing Rayquaza where the gold-ranked Team Act couldn't? Now, it should also be mentioned that this story isn't exactly unique either. Then again, no story is unique. Personally, what makes a story work for me is the characters. Although the plot is pretty safe and by the numbers, I really remember this story for the characters involved. The player's partner, Gardevoir, and Gengar are really standouts for me. Although the player character is primarily a silent protagonist, there are still times in which you do respond to situations and actively talk. You're just mostly a silent protagonist. And usually these events are during important story scenarios, like confessing your feelings, and worrying with your partner, and learning things from Gardevoir. Your partner in particular. Ooh, let me talk about your partner. This Pokemon is awesome. From a surface level standpoint, they support the player by covering their type weaknesses. From a narrative standpoint, they are your greatest friend. They stick with you through thick and thin, and is the only Pokemon willing to get to the bottom of the situation by becoming a fugitive alongside you. What's great is that the player and their partner have a give and take relationship. They both benefit greatly from each other's company. The partner arguably wouldn't have been able to start the rescue team without the player. Likewise, the player wouldn't have been able to live up to their destiny without a loyal friend like the partner. The two are comfortable enough to share their feelings, doubts, and celebrations with one another. The last aspect of the narrative that I'd like to discuss is the setting as a whole. I wish there was a really cool fantasy sounding name for the world of this game, but it's only ever referred to as the world of Pokemon. Oh, hold on a second. I need a break from writing this script. I need to get back to the real world. You know, the world of humans. Cheekiness aside, this world seems to be an alternate reality to that seen in the main series. It's called the world of Pokemon because you don't really see any humans. It's implied that humans used to be in this world, perhaps a long time ago, but they've been relegated to myths or legends as of present day. I like the idea of a world entirely inhabited by Pokemon with no humans. Pelipper serving as postmen, Persians as bankers. Stuff like that is cool and it makes sense. Something that doesn't really make sense to me though are the mystery dungeons themselves. In game, they're described as magical locations that just sort of popped up one day. They literally change shape and layout each time someone enters them. Okay, so when exactly does the layout change? What about the Pokemon that are already inside the dungeon when the layout so-called changes? Are the wild Pokemon found in these locations just conjurations of the dungeons? No, that can't be it, because you recruit these Pokemon to your team, and they seem to be perfectly functioning real Pokemon. I don't know. Something just doesn't sit well with me about the way these dungeons work. I would much prefer if these locations were just that. Regions or areas of the world that simply exist. They would be large enough so that each excursion through them would be different. So it would seem like the layout is different, even though it's still the same place. But this really is just a nitpick on my part. I don't think I've ever seen anyone else complain about the lore of the mystery dungeons. Now, let's shift gears and talk about the other aspect of the game, the gameplay. As you've seen from the footage, Red Rescue Team is a roguelike dungeon crawler. You travel through different locations, managing all sorts of resources, HP, hunger, items, and your teammates. Since each dungeon is randomly generated from floor to floor, you never really know what to expect. Each excursion will be slightly different from the last. This adds replayability, but I personally feel the game relies a bit too much on the randomness. There's only so much strategy required to get through the majority of the game. Honestly, a lot of things can go wrong during a dungeon, and many of those things aren't necessarily the player's fault. The game is still turn-based because the computers won't do anything until the player takes an action. This can be anything from moving a square, to making an attack, to using an item. The goal is to traverse a floor and make your way to the stairs. This spot will transport you to the next floor, rinse and repeat. Although there are several different mission types in the game, they all play out pretty much the same way. There's the simple, make it to this floor and find this Pokemon mission. Then there's the deliver an item mission, which is the exact same thing as the rescue type mission, except now you have to devote an inventory slot to a specific item. Of course, the worst of these are escort missions. They're bad because the Pokemon you're trying to escort is usually really weak, and they have terrible AI. Each of these three mission types play out the same way though, and they don't really change up the gameplay or strategy at all. They serve more as difficulty settings rather than unique quest types. The combat of the game is integrated alongside the exploration of a dungeon because you'll run into enemies quite frequently. Every character has a simple basic attack that they can always perform. Then, like in the main series, each Pokemon can know up to 4 moves at a time. These are much more powerful and often have a longer range or can affect multiple enemies at once. The downside to moves is they have a limit on the number of times you can use them in a dungeon. A unique mechanic is linking. Basically, you can tie any number of moves together and use them all back to back in the same turn. For example, you can link Leer and Tackle together so that you drop the opponent's defense before striking them physically, increasing the damage output. There's not really a downside to linking moves together, so I don't know why you wouldn't want to do this. The bulk of the gameplay is just exploring these dungeons, so when you're not doing this, what are you doing? Well, you're going through Pokémon Square, the main hub of the game. Here you can buy new items, take on missions, deposit money, and organize your team and inventory. The combat and dungeon exploration in this game is definitely passable. It's good as an introductory to the genre, and it was indeed my introduction to roguelike games. Looking back on it though, I definitely see just how repetitive and simple the game truly is. Although the aesthetics of the dungeons can appear to be vastly different, the layouts usually aren't that unique. Some dungeons may focus more on large open rooms with nothing in them, while others may be a mostly winding maze of tight passageways. But that's just about it. Those are about the only 2 terrains that you'll run into from a mechanical point of view. If each dungeon layout was more organic, I think it would help each dungeon stand out a little better. Of course, making open rooms have more unique shapes, and having small tunnels that branch off into other tunnels or other rooms would make it a bit more difficult to program and harder to look natural when using a generator. Not only that, but moves are also really bland. Either it's a melee attack, so basically just a more powerful basic attack that can possibly exploit elemental weaknesses, or it's a long-range attack that can hit enemies from a distance, like Flamethrower or Ice Beam. Sure, there are a few attacks that hit all enemies in a room, but they're mindless to exploit and oftentimes really overpowered in the hands of an enemy. Balancing is really weird in this game. Although I felt the main story of the game was pretty well balanced in terms of difficulty, only the final dungeon was a really big difficulty spike for me. The post-game's difficulty is really all over the place. It's hard to tell in which order you should do the post-game dungeons. Also, a lot of these extra dungeons have strange conditions and handicaps that try to make the game more difficult, but in my experience, these attempts all fall flat. They either aren't that much of a challenge, just an inconvenience, like Buried Relic's dependence on specific items, or Unknown Relic's tedious recruitment process, and Joy Tower's cheap way of making recruitment more difficult. Or they're unfairly difficult, like Wish Cave, Meteor Cave, and Purity Forest. I've talked about my thoughts on those specific dungeons during my Let's Play of the game, but suffice to say they rely on overpowered enemies and cheap moves while giving you no safety net against unlucky crits. Again, I still think the combat and gameplay overall is serviceable, and I enjoyed it both as a kid and even now. It's just rough around the edges and hasn't aged as well as it should have. Several issues I had with the gameplay has been remedied in future games in the series, but I'm reviewing Red Rescue Team, not Explorers of Sky, Gates to Infinity, or Super Mystery Dungeon. The last big thing I want to talk about is the soundtrack. I know some people don't really care for music in games that much, but I'm not like that. Music is just as important to me as visuals in a game. I'm just going to cut to the chase. The music in Red Rescue Team is phenomenal. I know a lot of people give GBA games crap for having a really limited sound font, and sure, there are probably a few games out there that have songs that would be better suited on a system other than the GBA, but personally I loved, or at least liked, a lot of the music from the GBA as a whole. That being said, the music of Red Rescue Team is really atmospheric and ambient. Pokémon Square feels alive and lived in. Mount Thunder sounds really imposing and ominous. The boss battle music really makes you feel like you're in over your head. And Sky Tower feels both triumphant and exasperating at the same time. These songs sound amazing the first time you hear them, and continue to sound great after they repeat. That's really important because a lot of the dungeon tracks loop over and over again. Now, of course, not every song is a masterpiece or anything like that. There are a few duds in the soundtrack, but overall, it's really great. A lot of the songs sound mysterious and make me think of old school JRPGs like FF6 or Chrono Trigger. The one thing every song in this game has in common is emotion. Every song will make you feel something, guaranteed. Joy, sadness, tension, relief, confusion, you name it, you will feel it. You can explore a rainbow of emotions by listening to this soundtrack. Now, the sound effects of the game, they're a different story. Some of them are kind of charming, but none of them hold a candle to the sound design shown in the soundtrack. A lot of attack sound effects or item noises are too loud or too quiet. Some of them are just kind of annoying in my opinion. Now, I firmly believe that a reviewer should make suggestions as to how a game could have been improved for them. Obviously, this is subjective, and I'm not saying that all reviewers should be proficient in game design or anything like that, but I just don't think it does any good to say what you didn't like about a game without saying what you would have liked about it. So let me take a few moments and go over a couple things that I think would have made the game better in my opinion. Personally, I felt the story and characters were the best parts about the game. I think it could have benefited more from doubling down in this department and really making the story come to life. I think there should have been more mandatory party members like Magnemite and Absol. I also feel these characters should have had a larger impact on the story. I mean, I get why they left other party members as blank slates. Red Rescue Team is a monster collecting game, and the biggest appeal is the fact that you can customize your team however you want. The story had to be designed to really only take into account the player and their partner. But again, I just feel that that was wasted potential. Speaking of story changes, evolution in Pokemon has always been depicted as a combination of things. Either a Pokemon's really strong, so it evolves, or it reaches a certain age, or its bond to its trainer forces an evolution. No matter what though, evolution is like a physical embodiment of the symbolic change within a Pokemon. Since the characters of the protagonist and your partner grow so much during the story of Red Rescue Team, I always felt it would have been impactful if they would have been able to evolve during the story at some point, and not just to some throwaway mechanic in the post-game. Now, I know there was a story reason as to why no one was able to evolve until the post-game, but I just don't think that was a good call. Pokemon is known for its evolving critters. Why would you block that feature off until after the main story? Allowing your Pokemon to evolve before the end of the game would also make more sense from a story standpoint. Like, I find it very hard to believe that a Mudkip and a Charmander could defeat Zapdos, Moltres, Articuno, Groudon, and even Rayquaza. But a Swampert and Charizard? Okay, still a bit of a stretch, but definitely more believable. Moving on to combat improvements. Honestly, the turn-based nature of the combat in this game really doesn't work for me. Turn-based mechanics really work when strategy is at the forefront, but Red Rescue Team demands only a small inkling of strategy. What matters most is having an appropriately leveled Pokemon with a favorable typing. That's it. The way the game is now, I feel the combat is too clunky and the pacing is all weird. Either you one-shot everything you come across, rendering the fights with enemies to be little more than temporary obstacles, or it's too bogged down because you have to wait for every single Pokemon in the monster house to take their turns before you have a chance to respond. The way I see it, there are two ways to handle this. Either shift combat to a real-time battle system, potentially screwing up how well the turn-based nature works with the exploration aspect of the game, or embrace the turn-based nature of combat and really focus on strategy. This is my favorite option. How would Spike Chunsoft accomplish this? Well, when I think of dungeon crawling, I think of Dungeons and Dragons. I think of each character having a role that they perform on a team. The fighter soaks up lots of damage and draws enemy attention. The rogue dashes in and out of combat to deal high amounts of damage. The wizard brings utility and AoE spells, setting up their foes for failure. And the cleric heals and buffs their team, allowing them to be at their best. Imagine for a moment if Mystery Dungeon was structured more like 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Fights would be a bit more dynamic, as Pokemon move about the dungeons, seeking cover and vantage points. Take Team Act for example. Charizard could fly around and spit streams of fire down on enemies. Alakazam would have a large variety of out-of-combat spells. Tyranitar could reshape the battlefield and cause so much destruction that enemies would have to focus him, and not his squishier teammates. So let's take this a step further, and take into consideration skill challenges, and see how a Dungeons & Dragons coat of paint would feel on the exploration side of things. I've mentioned earlier that the games would benefit more from unique dungeon layouts. What if there were non-combat obstacles that prevented passage? Take Frosty Forest. What if there were occasionally thick brambles that needed to be cut through or burned away? Or in Magma Cavern, there could be a steep gorge that would need to be carefully traversed. You could fly safely down, worrying only about ranged attackers and other flying enemies, or it could be climbed down. This could be an alternate slower path and take up more hunger and resources, but it would give you another option. In fact, the IQ system that's currently in the game could be reworked into a skill system from D&D or something similar to that. This could open up a lot more strategy. Now you have to manage resources in a new way, and you could have some Pokemon who are straight up bad at fighting, but bring a lot of out-of-combat utility to the table. Okay, I may have gotten a little too away from the core of Mystery Dungeon with these gameplay suggestions. I'll admit, the changes that I'm suggesting are a bit extreme, and some people may feel these improvements would completely change the game, making it no longer recognizable as a Mystery Dungeon game. And I kind of get that. In fact, that's kind of what I was going for. Again, I love the Mystery Dungeon series, but it's not because of the gameplay. It's because of the story and characters. Personally, I would like to see the setting and story of Mystery Dungeon brought back with a huge overhaul to the gameplay. But if I had to keep the mechanics mostly the same, what changes would I fix with the series? Well, a lot of things that were handled poorly in Red Rescue Team have been fixed, or at least somewhat mitigated in future Mystery Dungeon titles. But I'll summarize a few of the nuisances. One of the biggest problems I had with Red Rescue Team was that recruitment of new allies was a huge chore. First, you need to make sure you have a friend area, then your leader, and only your leader, must deliver the final blow in a dungeon. Then it's a random chance to actually recruit. Even then, you're only able to recruit a max of 3 Pokemon per excursion, because a recruited teammate still takes up a spot on the team. This is because the max team size is 4. Even then, a recruit is still just a temporary recruit until you complete the dungeon with them. All of these stipulations just makes recruitment more tedious. It would be better to get rid of the friend areas, make it so that a recruited Pokemon automatically warps out of a dungeon and is permanent upon recruitment, and maybe make it so that any team member can land the final blow, removing accidental team kills. Since monster collecting is such a huge aspect to the game, why not make it a game mechanic in and of itself? Don't let it be a mindless, passive thing like it is now. Instead, another suggestion is something that I've seen in Persona 5. You obtain new personas in that game by negotiating with them. So it's not a random chance when you get a new persona. You must hold the enemy up by utilizing strategy, and then pay attention to the persona's mood, selecting the correct options. A mechanic like this would make recruitment a bit more engaging for me. Other improvements to the game as a whole would be improving item management. Some items are simply way better than others. There are only a handful of even remotely useful items. Orbs especially are notoriously useless. Then other items like Reviver Seeds are grossly overpowered. If items were rebalanced, and maybe if the toolbox had a smaller max size, it would make item decisions a bit more important. Team management in Red Rescue Team also has a lot of finicky parts. It's annoying to put together a team in preparation for a dungeon because you have to go into each individual friend area and talk to a recruit. Then you can get them to join your team, but only if you have room. You also need to talk to them again to get them to become a leader. Once you're in a dungeon, I was also let down by the selection of strategies that you can give to your teammates. The important ones are there: stay together, go separately, attack anything in sight. These have their uses, but an individual teammate's AI is usually pretty dumb. They rarely exploit type advantage or useful move combinations. They also love to waste power points or never use a move at all. And I know that some IQ skills do make this a little better, but it takes a lot of grinding to get to that point, and it also doesn't completely solve the problem. For example, you can tell a teammate to use only moves, or never use moves. I can't tell them to use a move once in order to gain bonus experience, and then rely on basic attacks to maximize power point usage. I think some of these IQ skills should have been carried over into a strategies section and then fleshed out a little bit more. Speaking of IQ, I think there should be a bit more unique skills or passive abilities instead of the AI changing stuff. Maybe something like Gale Force from Fire Emblem Awakening. After you defeat an enemy, you immediately get another turn. Or what if there's an IQ skill that lets you take a hit for one of your adjacent allies? You know, stuff like that. Whew. At first, I didn't think I'd have this much to say about Red Rescue Team, but as I was composing my thoughts, more and more things came to mind. So I apologize for the long wait in this video, but it took me a while to figure out what all I wanted to say and how to say it. But what do you all think about Red Rescue Team? Again, I really enjoyed the game, and I will always cherish my experiences with it. But I still believe it hasn't aged as well as some other games of its time. The sequels definitely do their part in harnessing the spirit of Mystery Dungeon and taking it to new levels. Maybe we'll get to those games someday. Anyways, I pray you all have a blessed day, and I'll see you in the next one.